Today, I want to spend some time celebrating, if you will, what we're calling America Saves Week, put on by a lovely organization. The link to their website is in their bio. That in their words, right, they set aside a week every year to motivate, encourage, and support helping people, particularly young people, save money, right? Which not only just involves putting money in your bank account, but also paying down debt and just overall building your wealth. Particularly, their words, not mine, through automated savings, which is something we've talked about here in the past as well. It's a great organization. Wanted to spend some time talking about how I think of saving, if you will, and first and foremost, I touched on it a little bit already. Saving money to me does not just mean adding money into your bank account, if you will, right? That certainly counts, but paying down your debt is something that counts as saving as well. There are two primary metrics that I look at to evaluate people's overall financial health. The first one of which is your net worth, right? How much stuff do you own, from money in the bank, investments, things like that, minus the debt that you owe, right? What does that number look like? And particularly, how does that number change over time? Over time, we want to see that number grow, of course. And so to that point, right, you can direct your savings toward either side of that net worth equation. You can either save more money up to increase the amount of stuff you have, the assets that you have, or you can direct that money toward paying down debt, or to reduce your overall debt. Either one of those will increase your net worth. So just know when I say savings throughout this whole video, what I'm referring to is either putting money into your bank account or into your investment accounts, or paying down debt. But that's the first metric, right? Net worth. The other one, though, is what I want to talk about today. And it's a harder one to describe and calculate. It's a big part of what I do technically behind the scenes in working with clients. But it has to do with retirement. And in particular, the metric that I'm concerned about here is, what's the probability or what's the likelihood that you're going to be able to retire, right, at a decent retirement age, whatever that means for you, and not run out of money over the course of your life, right? What's the likelihood you're going to be able to retire when you want to retire, and not run out of money? Again, it's a very hard metric to calculate. We'll save that for another time probably. But I wanted to talk through that challenge of getting to the point where you can feel confident that you're ready to retire, even though it's a little way. I think this is going to be a real challenge for a lot of people in our generation over the coming decades, right? Being able to quote unquote retire. Why, right? Why is retirement going to be a challenge for many of us? Right, this won't shock you probably, but most of us are saving less for retirement than our previous generations that came before us did. Why? Well, quite frankly, there's a lot of reasons, very few of which, if any, are our fault. But there's a lot of reasons why we're seeing this in the data. First and foremost, student loan payments, right? For many of us, we're directing would-be retirement or long-term savings toward paying down student loan debt in a way that generations before us just flat out did not have to do. Number two, rising cost of housing. For our parents and grandparents, if you go back to take a look at the historical data, average housing prices in America, when they were in their 20s looking to buy a house, the average house sold for about 2 times the national average salary. If the national average salary was $45,000, the average home price in America was $90,000 for both our parents and grandparents. Today, the average home price is 4 times the average salary in America. And I probably don't need to tell you that in major US cities where most of the jobs are for young people these days, that number is exponentially higher. It costs a lot more to buy a house than it ever did before. Okay. That's number 2, rising cost of housing. Number 3, lower company retirement benefits. Most of our grandparents had access to pensions, right? The employee, they worked for one employer, they took a job in their 20s, they worked for them for their entire career. The employer took care of them throughout their career and then funded their retirement when they left as well. Those are around in certain professions these days, but they are much, much rarer. I probably don't need to tell you that. Some of our parents had them too, but these days with the rise of independent contractor positions to the quote unquote gig economy, right? Even something like a 401k plan at a company is harder to come by than it used to be, and employers have been kind of reducing matches a little bit over the past decade or so as well. On the company side, we're not getting as much help. And along those lines, reason number 4, why it's we're having a harder time getting ready to retire than previous generations. Wage growth has not gone up a whole lot since the financial crisis a little over a decade ago. Wages have gone up certainly over time, but they're not keeping up with the pace that they used to be growing at, which again, year over year, is causing us to have a harder time keeping up with saving for retirement. And number 5, Social Security and Medicare. You know, when I first kind of shifted from working with older folks at the company I worked with before I went out on my own to now working with mostly younger people now, one of the things I've been fascinated by is just that the overall level of pessimism that people in our generation have about Social Security and Medicare. And I think it's well warranted, right? You know, unless Congress decides to get its act together, good luck with that. Right, Social Security and Medicare will be starting to cut benefits about 15 to 20 years from now. You know, quite frankly, simply put, right, we, you know, our cost of living is higher. We're paying down debt in our 20s in a way that we didn't used to be. We're getting less help from our companies, less help from the government. It's hard, right? You know, we're facing a bigger set of challenges than our parents and grandparents did in terms of long-term savings. That doesn't mean we can't catch up. We will, right? Student loans will go away over time, you know, as you go through your career. But the problem with not being able to get started early when it comes to retirement savings, it is quite simple, 2 words: compound interest. You know, if you spent any time looking into the you know, personal finance blogs, you know, articles, things like that, you often hear the you know, the term compound interest described as something that's magical or a miracle, right? You often see the miracle of compound interest, right? The idea, if you're not familiar, is that the you know, the longer you keep your money invested for, the amount your investments are going to grow gets exponentially higher over time, assuming a constant investment rate, which is a whole other conversation. For example, if you take $1,000, invest it today, and let's say you invest it in a way that you're going to make 8% per year, the year from now, that $1,000 is going to grow by 80 cents. Right, or I'm sorry, $80, right? You'll be up to $1,080 a year from now. It takes about 9 years for that $1,000 to double into $2,000. But over time, let's say over 40 years, that $1,000 is going to turn into $22,000 at an 8% constant growth rate. You're going to go from earning 80 cents on that $1,000 in year 1 to almost $2,000 in the 40th year. Right, the longer you keep your money invested for, the year-over-year growth gets exponentially bigger over time, which is the way that previous generations that came before us have been able to sufficiently save for retirement, is to leave their money invested over these longer periods of time. The key, though, again, right, is that we're starting later, or we're investing less in our 20s than generations did before us. Which means that starting early isn't something we're necessarily completely doing, right? We're needing to direct our money elsewhere in our 20s. A lot of us are going back to things like grad school as well. You know, we're putting more and more of our money towards shorter term goals, buying a house, paying down student loans, and less of our money toward retirement savings. And that's causing us to lose this compound interest effect. You know, we're maybe not completely, but we're not benefiting from it as much as generations before us have been, which is just going to make it that much harder for us to retire at a quote unquote decent age. Now this isn't completely a bad thing. To be honest with you, you shouldn't be putting all of your money into retirement accounts for saving for 50 years from now, right? I often see people like who really dislike working and dislike their jobs, right? Try to make themselves as miserable as possible, save as much money as they can, just so 30 or 40 years can go by and they can quit and completely change their life. Right. I'd rather have you, you know, save for short, medium, and long-term goals so that you can kind of create your dream life right now, so that you might not actually ever want to retire. You know, again, balancing short and long-term things, and particularly on the career path front, right? You know, setting yourself up for a sustainable, long-term, fulfilling career is the number one priority, I think. And after that, retirement savings will come into place to the degree that to the degree that it needs to. But I'd rather have you focus on these things so that you're not actually in a rush to retire, right? You'll be better off in the long run if you do that. But that being said, of course, we all want to retire at some point. You know, of course we do. So how do we fix this, right? You know, if we're saying that it's harder for us it's going to be harder for us to retire, right? What do we need to do differently? And the answer is actually surprisingly simple. you need to save more. You need to save more. Not necessarily for retirement, but you need to be putting more and more money either away in your savings and investment accounts, or use that money to pay down debt and can continue to do that over time. That includes student loan debt. I've talked about that several times already, but also mortgage debt if you have one. Although buying a house is not necessarily the way I would tell you to save. Right, buying a house is a decision about buying a house rather than an investing decision. We're going to talk a lot more about that next week at this time. But just overall, right, putting more money away toward these short, medium, and long-term things. Right? Why? Right? Why is it that saving for short-term things is going to help you retire in the long run if your money isn't being set aside for retirements? And to do that, right, I'd ask you to take a step back and think about the two primary inputs. The two primary things we're going to look at in the retirement savings calculation, right? How do you figure out how much you need to retire? First and foremost, right, the number one thing we care about is how much do you have saved, right? That's the primary thing we think about when it comes to putting money away for retirement. Once you have enough money in the bank, you can retire. We've talked about that one a lot up until today, but I want to focus on the second one. Because just having enough money in the bank is not sufficient to decide when you can retire. You also need to take a step back and think about how much do you spend each year? How much are you going to spend every year in retirement? The lower your spending is, the less you need to retire in the first place, right? And that's what I'm saying, right? If you're saving money rather than spending it, and do that over a long period of time, compound interest isn't the most important thing to you anymore. Instead, it's keeping that cash flow constraint set up in such a way that you're not going to need as much money set aside to retire in the first place because you don't spend it as much. You can think of like saving for retirement like filling a bucket with water, if you will. I'm going to have to make like a graphic or something for this at this point, or at some point, right? Over the course of your career, you're putting money into your retirement savings accounts, right? You're filling the bucket with the water that is your retirement savings. Once you get to retirement, hopefully the bucket's full. Think of it as poking a hole in the bottom of the bucket, right? Water's going to start to flow out from the bottom. You can think of that as the money you're spending in retirement, right? The challenge for figuring out how much you need to actually retire is balancing, right? The amount of money that's water, the amount of water, aka money, in the bucket in the first place versus how quickly the water is flowing out. Because you don't want to get to a situation where you put all the water in the bucket and then you find it gets empty in 10 years. So you need to make sure that money lasts for your entire retirement. And so if you spend a lot, you better make sure there's a ton of water in that bucket, right? Because there's going to be a ton of water flowing out each and every year. In other words, if you spend a lot of money, you need to make sure you have a ton of money saved up in order to retire. But if you don't spend a whole lot, the water is just going to slowly trickle out of the bucket, if you will, which means you don't need as big a bucket in the first place. The bucket doesn't need to be as full as it would if you spent $30,000 or more a year than you usually do. Right? That's the key. It is saving money, even if it's not for retirement, gives you a double benefit when it comes to retirement savings. First and foremost, the first benefit, if you're actually adding savings to your retirement accounts, you're filling up the bucket faster, right? So you can reach the point where it's full earlier than you would be able to otherwise. But as we've discussed, that's the problem, right? Is that losing a lot of the benefits of compound interest by starting to save for retirement later on, you end up losing the benefit of a lot of that. On the other hand, right, if you're spending less money, right, regardless of what you do with the extra cash, paying down debt, saving it for shorter intermediate type things, you're slowing the speed at which the water is flowing out of the bucket in the first place, which means that you need to have less saved up to begin with. It's an interesting concept to think about, but there really is this double benefit that you get from putting money aside either to grow your savings or to pay down your debt, right? You're building up more money over time. You're building that net worth that we talked about, which is going to allow you to retire faster. And you're making it easier for you to retire in the first place by needing to have less cash on hand when you hit retirement age, right? The key is focusing on both sides of those things and maintaining it over time, right? Once your student loans are paid off, you're not going to get this benefit if you redirect that spending toward buying a car every 2 or 3 years, right? The key is then to shift it to saving to fund something else. We might not be getting the full benefit of this compound interest idea if you're facing a lot of these shorter term financial hurdles right now. But the key is you're still putting yourself in a good position to retire in the future by keeping that savings number high as you start to work through some of these things. So long story short, if you're feeling behind on retirement savings, like almost everybody I talk to does, you might not be as behind as you think you are, right? The key is, right, how much of your money is going toward building your net worth in some way, either by adding to your bank accounts or to paying down your debt. And then as you work through each of the loans that you're working to pay down, and saving for each of these savings goals that you have, redirecting that money toward a different savings goal. If you do that over time, you'd be surprised at how quickly you might be able to catch up. So anyway, I hope this was helpful. It's a little bit of a different take on savings than particularly retirement savings than a lot of people have. When we get this up on the site, we'll have a few graphics, a bucket of water and all that might help visualize this a little bit more. But I hope this is helpful in terms of giving you some things to think through as we work through this America Saves Week. Again, I think it's a great organization. We're going to be contributing to you're going to be seeing some more video content from me later on this week, a little bit shorter than these typically are. But again, I'm really looking forward to participating. And again, hope this is helpful. My name is Bill Nelson, Pacesetter Planner. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Thanks so much.